This town, Phoenix, Oregon, about 4,600 people also seem to get out. But over and over again, you hear stories of people just scrambling to get whatever they could to get out of their house in time. Here is how one gentleman described it to us.
A few minutes later, a fire engine pulled in, then a cop car, and so several vehicles giving the warning. You think you're prepared, but when it comes right down to it, you just lose focus and you just grab what you can and get out.
It's that sense, you know, of just utter panic, automatic reactions, people grabbing a single thing, a handful of papers, and getting out. Over and over again, people seem to have managed to save their own lives just barely. Meanwhile, this whole region that we're under is under a mandatory go designation. That's a mandatory evacuation for everybody. And so we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people under some form of evacuation order right now here in Southern Oregon, Allison.
Jake, how about the weather? I know over in California, heat and dry winds, those Santa Ana winds have really been an issue. How about there in Oregon? How are the weather conditions playing into these fires?
You know, it's very strange. You know, I live and work in Northern California where you're used to a certain amount of fire season conditions coming together. But coming up here to Oregon, I am standing right now if you hadn't told me, I would think that I was in the Santa Ana winds of Los Angeles right now. It is a hot, dry, sideways wind right now that's kicking a lot of these embers back to life. And that helps to explain some of the devastation we've seen here. Let me just show you. When we first arrived here, we thought that the scale of it really only went so far. Then today, in the daylight, with the flames dying down, we could walk through this entire community, more than 131 homes destroyed here. We then went as far as we could and could see that the next development beyond here was also destroyed, and the next one after that seems to be as well. The scale of the devastation is shocking here, Allison, but it's the speed with which this wildfire hit an urban area and swept right through it in a way that no one was prepared for, Allison.
It's just absolutely incredible and horrific. Jake, thanks so much for sharing the stories, and send our best to the folks there. I know they're going through a whole lot.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.